Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. That's as if there we go. I'll start again. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to get a chance to welcome you to today's conversation. I want to thank our MIT's Department of Economics and the MIT Sloan School for helping to organize the conversation this afternoon. The topic of today's conversation, the new paradigm for financial markets, is also the title of the most recent book by our distinguished guest, George Soros. And as I'm sure we are all acutely aware, there couldn't be a better time or a better place, or frankly, better company for this conversation. MIT has a tradition of being open to hearing controversial views, and in a complex, uncertain time like the present, it's important that we get all views out into conversation. Guiding the conversation this afternoon will be Professor Ricardo Caballero. He is the Ford International Professor of Economics and head of the Department of Economics, which is widely considered among the very best in the world. Professor Caballero is also co-director of the World Economic Laboratory and an NBER Research Associate in Economic Fluctuations and Growth. His own work has particular relevance to this moment. He considers global capital markets, speculative episodes in financial bubbles, and how, or from today's perspective, whether there are mechanisms that could prevent or mitigate systemic crises. Professor Caballero's background is clearly well attuned to the present, but of course, so is that of our guest, George Soros. Starting in the 1970s, George Soros made a name for himself and a fair amount of money as leader of the Quantum Fund, among the original hedge funds, and one whose performance has never been surpassed. More recently, he's made his mark as an author, a brilliant philanthropist, a supporter of emerging democracies, and the founder of the Open Society Institute. He has been prescient in his understanding of the impending financial crisis and its magnitude. He predicted the burst of the housing bubble well in advance of most others and recognized the gravity of the current crisis well before it was obvious to most. We are absolutely delighted to have Mr. Soros here today to engage in a conversation. We welcome him to the MIT campus, and we all look forward to his conversation with Professor Caballero. And the floor will be open for questions after some introductory questions between the two of our guests this afternoon. Thank you very much.
So it's a great honor for me to introduce and moderate a discussion with Mr. George Soros. He's not only a legendary speculator, and his name is a brand in itself, but as Susan mentioned, he has shown a deep concern for making a difference in this world in a wide variety of areas. The book, which provides a background for today's discussion, offers a fascinating mixture of personal experiences, history of science, philosophy of science, real-time finance, economic forecasts, and policy prescriptions, everything in less than 160 pages, or slightly more than 160 pages. But I think one of the points, this book is a bit like a polyphony. There are many layers and many voices, and some of them really sound like music. But I think one of the mega messages of the book is that it makes sense to talk about all these things at the same time, because they are intertwined through the principle of reflexivity. And trying to disentangle them, to talk about things in isolation, as we tend to do in the natural sciences, risks missing the big picture. And that's sort of a subliminal and sometimes explicit message present in the book. The book is a powerful explanation of how rigid imposition of simple equilibrium models can lead to counterfactual predictions and inappropriate policy recommendations. I really share that view. Moreover, I would argue that that's very distinctive of MIT's economics department. It's an eclectic department where we don't shy away from looking at the frictions, even though it makes our models a bit clumsier. But I think we try to focus on the frictions and understanding how those frictions modify the outcomes of the simple models and how they fundamentally change, many times fundamentally change the policy prescription. So it's important for us, Mr. Soros, that somebody with your wisdom and with your experience supports this research agenda. It's very encouraging to us. Now, the plan for today, as an understanding, is that I will ask a few questions. I will try to guide you through the book. So I will at least attempt to follow the structure of the book, but I understand that you may want to deviate, and you have a good tradition in doing so, but that will make it only more interesting. So I'll try to follow the book, and I want to separate the set of questions into 4 groups. The first one is the early chapters is about your life and how the concept of reflexivity developed, again, as a result of your growth in both in your life and in the financial markets. Then I want us to start moving towards the crisis, but rather than plunging directly in the current crisis, I want to talk to you about the structure, the global structure, the financial structure, the economic structure, what you call the super bubble. And then I want us to understand a bit how the real estate bubble fits within the super bubble. And finally, I want us to conclude with the current crisis. The book is fascinating. It stops halfway through the crisis. And so there's a few chapters to be written, and probably we can discuss them right here.
Well, it's a long agenda you got, so
yes.
I hope we can cover
so I'll
it all.
interrupt you frequently, so we keep it then. So the first question is, I would like you to tell us a little bit about your early steps in life in the financial world and how that led to the reflexivity principle and ideas.
Well, looking back, I would say that the formative year of my life was 1944. Being a Hungarian Jew, Hungary was occupied by the Germans, and we would have been deported and killed in Auschwitz. Fortunately, my father had some previous experience with far from equilibrium situations like this, because he lived through the Russian Revolution. So with that experience, he understood that there are times when the normal rules don't apply. And so he took care of his family and a number of other people in false papers and so on. And we survived, all of us, most of us survived that period. And that was, in a way, the sort of the formative experience of my life. Then I went to England, studied economics. I didn't get much past the elementary economics, perfect competition with the assumption of perfect knowledge. And at the same time, I was reading Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, which was probably the most influential book in my intellectual development, because his explanation of fascism and communism, after I've experienced both of them, was very enlightening to me. And of course, the idea of perfect knowledge was totally opposed to his theory of science. And so that's when I started thinking about the relationship between us as thinking participants and the reality of our situation. And that was the beginning of and this really when I formulated this idea of reflexivity.
One interesting concept here is that in economics we have, typically when we try to understand multiple equilibria, which we call indeterminacy, we exchange the terms, that arises in economics. We use it to explain crisis because essentially it's very difficult to find shocks out there which are large enough to explain what happens in a crisis, these very large implosions of asset prices and so on. But the typical way it works in economics is by this occurs in situations where we care too much about the expectations of others. Mm-hmm. And you seem to have found that in a sort of broader and even principle, which is this principle of reflexivity. It seems to apply far more broadly than the very specific circumstances where we find it. Mm-hmm. So the question is why? Why is it so encompassing?
Look, let's say the basic proposition. and this may be helpful. I mean, the book deals with 4 levels of abstraction. There was this